the people who wrote the Bible. And so it seems to me like this part of the text could actually be a warning about the temptation of idolatry, the temptation of worshiping, seeking life somewhere other than the God who they had found life in. And so I think there's definitely some of that symbolism going on in the story with the snake can't be trusted because people are worshiping the snake, and the snake is actually bad news. But do you see why people in the ancient world would have begun to believe that there was some sort of, how many of you ever have gone under your house for something and found a snake skin? Does that not just change the temperature right away? Because is it still here? And somehow the skin is 8 feet long. You're like, I don't want to run into this dude, right? And so they believed they had these properties. A couple things about the names of people. We're introduced in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, they're not really named. In Genesis 2, they're given names. But actually, the names aren't personal names. They become personal names. My middle name's Adam. So they became personal names. But the names themselves were actually just descriptors. So the word Adam literally just means human being. It comes from the Hebrew word Adama. Let me hear you say Adama. It means ground or dirt. So in Hebrew, there's a word play. The Adam, the human being, came from the Adama. The first human being essentially was named Dirt Clod Guy. Right? It takes a whole new meaning to your name is mud. Right? His name is mud. His name is dirt bag. That's who he is. And then we're introduced to Eve. And Eve is comes from the Hebrew word Hava. Let me hear you say Hava. Bless you. The Hebrew word Hava essentially just means life or breath. Right? Eve is essentially called, she's known as, in the text it says, the mother of all living things. So you have these two human beings, Dirt Clod Guy and the mother of all living things. And they stand in so many ways. In the Hebrew scriptures, they stand, and especially even in the New Testament for Paul, Adam stands as sort of this symbolic figure of what can go wrong. And then Paul introduces this other, he calls him the second Adam, Jesus, who is essentially leading us to put those things right again. And then in the garden, there are two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they never actually go to the tree of life. Isn't that interesting? They're actually kicked out. In the story, it seems like the first thing you would do is I just want to take care of this living forever bit first. Right? And so you begin there. And they don't. They take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And people have spilled a lot of ink talking about what was the fruit. Was it an apple? I think if you're in that discussion, we've missed the point of the story. Right? We don't know what the fruit was. But what did it mean? What does the knowledge of good and evil mean? And throughout, especially Christian history, because people have been so obsessed with demonizing sex, one of the first things they said was, well, it must have been sex. And then most scholars are going to lie, it's actually probably not that. And we've tried to make all these different levels of guesses of what it could be, but I think it could be the most simple answer. What are you doing when you're deciding between good and evil? When you go into a courtroom, there's somebody behind a bench, and what are they deciding? Innocence and guilt. Good, evil. Good, bad. And what do you call the person who sits behind a bench in a courtroom? A judge. What if what this is about... What if the knowledge of good and evil is about judging? What if it's about judging who lives and who dies? What if it's about judging who's good and who's bad? What if it's about saying, I want to be in charge of deciding everyone else's fate? How many of you judge people on the regular? Oh, you're all so saintly. And you know you just lied. You do. You do, and I do. Do you ever do it and you're thinking it in your head because you would never say it out loud because you're a good Christian person and you don't judge people? And then when you do it in your head, you're like, oh, that's bad, but I know I'm right. You ever have that sort of experience with judging other people? I think that, what's the immediate fallout of their eyes being opened? Suddenly, what was fine and brought zero shame is the fact that they're both naked. Right? And we're actually told at the end of chapter 2, the man and his wife were naked and they felt no shame. There's an innocence to that, right? How many of you have kids that you can't keep clothes on them half the time when they're at home? Since he's not here today, I'll just tell you, since my oldest has been in the world, it's the minute he comes home, pants come off. It's just I'm home, right? And there's a certain point, though, where they become conscious of this. Right? I think this is what's happening with Adam and Eve. There's sort of the immediate decision they have to make is there's something wrong with him or her. There's a judgment. And the judgment is that this is awkward and this is uncomfortable. So if we think about the fallout in terms of judgment, they immediately go into shame, which is an unknown, at this point in the story, an unknown feeling. An unknown experience is feeling ashamed. And this is the thing about human beings, is we have a lot of differences, but everybody in this room, when I talk about feeling ashamed, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? We all have had this experience. And immediately, when they become ashamed, they hide. When they hear God walking in the garden, which is an interesting thing in and of itself, they hide. And God says, "Why are you hiding?" And the man says, "Because I'm naked." And God's like, "Who told you were naked?" And the guy was like, "Do you have to be told?" Like, is this, and there's this immediate hiding. And when they come out of the hiding, the blame begins. He says to the man, "How could you?" And he says, "Well, it was my wife." And he says to Eve, "How could you?" And Eve says, "Well, it was the snake." And he says to the snake, "How could you?" And the snake looked around and nobody else was there. So, like, dude's losing his legs. That's exactly what happens. The snake is cursed to slither on its belly for the rest of time. And it's explaining sort of the dislocation and the disintegrate. Everything in Genesis 2 is integrated. The relationship between human and God, the relationship between human and human, the relationship between human and the earth, the relationship between human and self. That self-critical voice that is in our head looping all the time, critiquing our performance as human beings, doesn't exist. Isn't part of the story. And then God ends up covering them with more than fig leaves. He covers them with animal skin. And they're exiled. They're kicked out of the garden. They're sent eastward. Now, I think there's something going on, because the story of the Hebrew Bible as a whole, from beginning to end of the Hebrew Bible, is telling a story about exile. It's telling a story about exile and this longing to return. So this is what happens in Genesis 2 and 3, right? The people start in paradise. They start in the land that is beautiful and bountiful, and then because of their decisions, they're sent out. This is the story of the Hebrew Bible. And I think in some ways, whoever wrote Genesis, chapter 2 and 3 and 4, they are sorting through this story. What does it mean to be kicked? Why did we get kicked out of our land, and what do we have to do to get back? And so the way the story of the Hebrew Bible goes, it begins with the story of Exodus. The Hebrew people are enslaved in Egypt. They're being forced by Pharaoh to build Pharaoh's empire. And God speaks to a man named Moses from a burning bush, right? How many of you know the story? And Moses, with some resistance, decides that he will be God's mouthpiece to the Egyptians. And so Moses goes, and there's all sorts of things that happen. But at the end of the story, the Israelites emerge from Egypt, freed from slavery, and they end up in the wilderness of Sinai, where they're given the law, and they wander for 40 years. Can you imagine the are we there yet questions? And you're like, no, we're just walking in a 40-year circle, just waiting on people to die. Like, that's exactly what they're doing. They're just walking in a circle, waiting for people to die. And then they enter into the land. And after they enter into the land, there's this conquest, which is a whole other set of issues. There's a conquest, and eventually they establish a monarchy. The first king is a guy named Saul, and he doesn't work out. Then Saul's son becomes king for like 27 minutes, and he gets killed. And then a young man, a warrior, a bloody guy named David becomes king. And when David dies, there's some contention for the throne. And it ends up his son Solomon, who shouldn't have actually been in line for the throne, becomes king. And Solomon, how many of you have heard of Solomon before? He's known for what? Wisdom. People from all over the world come to hear Solomon's wisdom. But you know what Solomon was known for among his people? He was known for high taxes and forced labor. Notice this from 1 Kings chapter 9. This is the story of the labor gang that King Solomon put together to build the Lord's temple. Think about those words. This is what Solomon did to build the temple of God. The God who does what? Liberates slaves. A temple is built for this God using slave labor. Solomon did not understand irony. This is unbelievable. And of course, he built his own palace as well as the step structure, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Those are all military outposts. Any non-Israelite people who remained of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, that is, all the descendants of such people who were still in the land because the Israelites weren't able to wipe them out, Solomon forced into the labor gangs that are still in existence today. So when this was written, they were still in existence. Solomon also used sort of a form of forced labor on his own people, where he would demand a month of service or a year of service, but for certain things. So people were being forced to work, and they weren't being treated justly. And what you find out is this becomes a rampant problem. As the monarchy eventually splits into two because of this. Because when Solomon dies, the people are fed up and they say, we're done. And so Solomon's descendants go south and the rest of them stay in the north. And whenever this happens, there's two successions of kings. And what you find is almost all of them to a T, except for a couple bright spots, continue doing these sorts of things. So you have a group of people called the prophets, who come around, and we often are told the prophets predict the future. That's actually not what a prophet does. A prophet is a mouthpiece for God. A prophet is somebody who's got fire in his or her bones, who stands up and says, this is what God says. What you're doing is wrong. So you have people like Amos who say, God is sick of your worship gatherings. When you guys get together and do your worship gatherings, it makes God physically ill. People like Jeremiah went to the very structure, the temple, and said, if you think this temple is going to save you from judgment, as you go out and you pillage the people and you imbalance the scales and you're oppressing the poor and you're stealing land from widows and you're doing these sorts of evil things, if you think God is going to protect you just because you've got this temple, you've got another thing coming. They weren't popular people. Right? Jesus even has this line where he says, you guys, like now you love the prophets, but when they were around, you tried to kill them. I mean, you think about this in our day. People like MLK, right? Who now most people, love MLK. If you go back in time, there were lots of people who didn't like MLK. Because prophets come with a message that is uncomfortable. And they challenge people to leave behind a destructive, self-centered way of living for something for the common good. And the prophets warn, if we don't remedy our ways, if we don't reform, if we don't start treating people justly, if we don't care for the poor, if we don't make space for the orphan, if we don't care for the widow, we're going to lose everything. And it's exactly what happened. Solomon was the new Pharaoh. Israel was the new Egypt. And eventually there would be a new Exodus. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquered and exiled from history the northern kingdom of Israel. Which means when they came in, they took them away, except for some of the poor and the sick who they left to sort of repopulate. This is where a group of people called the Samaritans came from, who are in the New Testament. There's a lot of conflict between them and the Jewish people. And so in 722 BCE, this 10 tribes of Israel ceased to exist. They're gone, and they never really are found again except through the Samaritans. And then in 587, the southern kingdom was destroyed by Babylon, and they were exiled. They eventually got to come home under Cyrus the Great of Persia when he defeated Babylon. But in 587, they watched the temple burn. The temple that would protect them, the temple that would save them, the temple because if we had a building with God's name on it, God will never let anything bad happen here. And as they watch it burn, they're taken into exile. There's a description of this event in 2 Kings, and I just want you to hear it. Now, Zedekiah, so the southern kingdom had become vassals of Babylon, which means they weren't taken over, but they had to pay taxes and tribute. Zedekiah rebelled against the Babylonian king. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's rule, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem with his entire army. He camped beside the city and built a siege wall around it. The city was under attack until King Zedekiah's 11th year. On the 9th day of the month, the famine in the city got so bad that no food remained for the common people. And if you listen to the book of Lamentations on this, it describes this on the other side of it. It says that essentially there were parents who were having to decide whether or not to eat their own children to survive. This is how bad it was within the walls of Jerusalem. The enemy broke into the city. All the soldiers fled by night using the gate between the two walls near the king's garden. How good do you feel about your chances when your military runs away? Like, this is where they are. The enemy breaks through, and the military people are like, nah, and they're gone. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, were surrounding the city, so the soldiers ran toward the desert plain Chaldean army chased King Zedekiah and caught up with him in the Jericho plains. His entire army deserted him. So the Chaldeans captured the king and brought